Thank you for downloading another podcast from Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan. Dave and I enjoy so much getting together and telling old radio stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Today, we continue our discussion of songs of the Old West, and I think you'll like the stories we tell. Thank you so much for listening to Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan. Welcome back, friends, to Hot Mic with Houston and Hogan, and Dave Hogan, Randy Houston here by your side on the radio. Well, we're not on the radio. We're on the podcast machine. I get confused. We've been on the radio so much in our how many years? We've got a whole bunch of years of. It's over 100 years of radio between the two of us. Over 100 years being on the radio, Dave.
Well, I don't want to talk about it.
But now
I'm not sure I want to talk about that.
But we're going to go back 100 years or more and continue our conversation about songs of the Old West and kind of switch gears to this episode and talk about the Singing Cowboys.
Let's talk first about, Singing Cowboys might fit. Let's talk about the Sons of the Pioneers.
Oh, please do. I'm a big fan.
Tumbling Tumbleweeds.
Cool Water.
Cool Water. Both written by Bob Nolan,
okay,
who was one of the original members of the Sons of the Pioneers. The Sons of the Pioneers, the founding members were Leonard Sly, Bob Nolan, and Tim Spencer. And then that was originally a trio.
Okay.
It was called the Pioneers Trio. And they had a radio show, and the announcer said one day, you guys are too young to be pioneers. Why don't we call you the Sons of the Pioneers? And so that name caught on, and the Sons of the Pioneers, up until recently, they may still. Some of them, of course, all the original members are long gone, but other singers kept the tradition going. One of the early members was Ken Curtis. Remember him?
That was Festus on
Gunsmoke.
Gunsmoke.
That's
yeah.
Festus, yeah. Ken Curtis was a member.
And the way he talked, you would have never thought that guy could sing like he could. But boy, he was a great vocalist.
Another member of the Sons of the Pioneers was Pat Brady.
Okay.
Now, you remember Pat Brady?
No, I don't.
He was Roy Rogers' sidekick.
Oh,
on the Roy Rogers Western movies. And he drove a Jeep. Roy rode Trigger, but Pat Brady, his sidekick, drove a Jeep. And I remember the name of the Jeep is Nellie Bell.
Nellie Bell.
Nellie Bell was the name of the Jeep in the Roy Rogers movies. Now, I mentioned that Leonard Sly was one of the founding members of the Sons of the Pioneers. He also got into acting with the name of Len Sly, and he appeared in bit parts of Gene Autry's cowboy western movies. Gene Autry was the huge star in the 1930s on the screen doing westerns.
Yeah.
And Len Sly had some bit parts. Well, Gene Autry had a falling out with Republic Films over money, and they needed a replacement for Gene Autry because they weren't able to come to terms with him. Later they did, later on, and he, after World War II, made a lot more movies. This was in the late 30s. And they said, we got this guy, Len Sly. He does a good job. Maybe we can turn him into a star. But that name, Len Sly, it just doesn't work.
Don't get it.
Don't work at all. So we need a cowboy name. Roy, that's a good name. One of the most famous people in America at that time, Will Rogers.
Will Rogers.
So Roy Rogers
was born.
I'll
be darned.
Yeah. Speaking of born, he was born in Cincinnati.
I didn't know that.
And he was born, I had a chance to meet Roy Rogers and his wife, Dale Evans, one time at the Disc Jockey Convention in Nashville. sat at the same table with them at an event. And Roy says, I was born where second base is at Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati. He was born in Cincinnati, and they built Riverfront Stadium on his old home place. Now they built a new baseball stadium in Cincinnati now called Great American Ballpark. But Riverfront Stadium was the stadium up until a few years ago that the Reds played in. And Roy says, I was born on second base at Riverfront Stadium. But he was a founding member of the Sons of the Pioneers and went on to rival Gene Autry in popularity in the cowboy films.
I was just about to remark, you're moving on up into, from Gene Autry's a little early for me, but Roy Rogers and Dale Evans, man, you talk about big. Yeah.
Roy was, of course, Gene Autry was the businessman in the industry. He wound up owning a bunch of radio stations, TV stations, the original owner of the California Angels, now the Los Angeles Angels baseball team.
Right.
Gene Autry, a very wealthy man and a great businessman. But Roy was a great businessman, too, because he had the foresight. He'd seen how a lot of people had been taken advantage of in the, at that time, young movie industry. So he had it in his contract that he had exclusive rights to his name, the name Roy Rogers. And so he was able to market his name. And there were Roy Rogers lunchboxes, Roy Rogers cap pistols, Roy Rogers air rifles, all kinds of Roy Rogers collectible items.
That is an amazing that you would bring that up. I was listening to Dale Earnhardt Jr. on his podcast recently, and he was talking about shortly after Dale Earnhardt Sr. passed away, then the company kind of dissolved, and he had a long legal battle to get his name back, Dale Earnhardt Jr., for the profitability of selling all that memorabilia.
Exactly. So Roy was had a lot of foresight in that regard. And Roy said way back when, he said, Trigger was about as famous as Roy was, his horse.
Right.
And Dale's horse was Buttermilk. And Roy would say, when Trigger dies, I'm going to have him stuffed. And when I die, they're going to stuff me and set me right on top of Trigger. Well, it happened that Trigger died, and they did have him stuffed.
I'd heard that.
So they also had Buttermilk. Now, that's a challenge for a taxidermist, I'm sure.
I'm sure.
Horse. But both Trigger and Buttermilk were, quote unquote, stuffed. That's the term that Roy used. By the way, Roy paid $2,500 for Trigger in, I believe, 1938.
Big money.
Comparable to over $30,000 today.
Big money.
So you can see that was quite an outlay for Roy at that time, but he fell in love with Trigger right from the get-go. But anyway, later on, as he reached retirement, he and Dale opened up the Roy Rogers Dale Evans Museum, which Margot and I had an opportunity to visit out in Victorville in Apple Valley in California. And they were both pack rats. There was everything in that museum from Roy's bowling shoes to Dale's bloomers. And both Buttermilk and Trigger were there.
Wow.
But the museum, after Roy and Dale passed on, son Dusty, he was known as Roy Rogers Jr., but they called him Dusty, had a hard time keeping the museum going, and they moved it to Branson and still had a hard time financially. And so, long story short, Dusty auctioned off all of their memorabilia. I think it came to over $3 million.
Ooh.
because the museum just was not financially viable. But we really, I hate that because I love museums. I love museums and really enjoyed the Roy Rogers Dale Evans Museum. Let's move along. Talk a little bit about one more song here, Cattle Call, which was written by Tex Owens and a huge hit by Eddie Arnold.
That's the version I remember, yeah.
Eddie Arnold. And then later, Eddie was joined by a young lady.
Deborah Allen?
No. I'll think of it in a moment. Not
Okay.
Tanya Tucker, but
You keep talking about cattle calling. I'll look it up here.
when the cattle prowling and the coyotes are howling out under the western sky, the cowboy singing, his spurs are a-jingling as down the trail he rides.
The Lonesome Cattle Call.
Cattle Call written by Tex Owens because Tex was staying in a motel and it was snowing. He looked out a motel window. There's a pasture nearby, and it looked like the poor old cattle were huddled together to stay warm. And he said, I wish I could do something for those cattle. And
Leanne Rimes.
Leanne Rimes. Yeah, there you go. There you go. She joined Eddie Arnold, and they had a later version of, it was the same song, but they had a more modern, up-to-date version of Cattle Call, and it's a hit all over again. But Tex and his band were playing, they had a radio show called Red Horse Ranch on KMBC, Kansas City. He looked out the window, and he saw all those cows gathered trying to keep warm in that snowstorm, and that's where the title came to him, Cattle Call.
Yeah.
I wish I could call those cattle into a warmer place. And right there he wrote Cattle Call. We've mentioned a couple of cowboy actors, Roy Rogers and Dale Evans, and all those cowboy movies. One of the biggest cowboy movies was High Noon. And Tex Ritter did the theme song. Do not forsake me, oh, my darling.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Gary Cooper starred in High Noon. Tex Ritter was an interesting man. I had the pleasure of having him on one of our country shindigs at the Asheville City Auditorium. And
Okay.
his son, John Ritter, at that time was a big star on TV, acting in the
Hit series. Three's Company.
Three's Company, yeah. Three's Company.
Hit TV series, yeah.
And Tex had another son named Tom. Tom was born with cerebral palsy, and Tom was with Tex in Asheville when Tex appeared on one of our country shindigs. Great guy. I love Tex Ritter. He told me a story. You know, he had a hit song called Green Grow the Lilacs. And Green Grow the Lilacs was made into a Broadway show. He told me that, and I think he did this on stage too, I think he told the story. He says that, you know, a slang word that Mexicans use for Americans, gringo.
Oh, yeah? Yeah.
And he said during the Mexican-American War, and I may be wrong here, but I think it was the late 1840s when the Mexican-American War happened. That was a very popular song among American soldiers, Green Grow the Lilacs.
Gringo.
And the Mexicans thought they were saying gringo. So they started calling them, the American soldiers, gringos.
Gringo.
After the song Green Grow the Lilacs. That was a story that Tex Ritter told. Some other Western movies you'll remember, Stagecoach, John Wayne, and Andy Devine. I loved Andy Devine. He was a great sidekick to John Wayne. John Wayne had a number of Westerns like True Grit and The Magnificent Seven. And a young Clint Eastwood had a big cowboy movie called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Then there was Henry Fonda in Once Upon a Time in the West. And in later years, Robert Redford and Paul Newman and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
Oh, yeah.
And you mentioned on one of our podcasts, I think the last one, Kevin Costner and Yellowstone.
Right.
Well, Kevin Costner also starred in a Western called Dances with Wolves.
Filmed right here in Western North Carolina.
Really?
Yeah, that's right. I think so.
I'm not sure about that because
What was the
I
one
remember
filmed in Lake Lure area? Dances with Wolves.
No, that was Dirty Dancing.
Well, that was filmed there also.
Yeah, Dirty Dancing. Dances with Wolves was out in the West.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah, all those Western scenes I remember vividly.
I was mistaken about that.
So I don't think it was filmed in Western North Carolina. But you never know with movies now how they can.
Very true.
Yeah. And now, in addition to movies, TV came along and Westerns moved from the movie theater to the television. Bonanza.
Doom diddle doom diddle doom diddle doom doo. Hoss and Joe, Adam, no.
Lorne Greene.
Was the name.
Lorne Greene was a Canadian who was Papa.
Dances with Wolves was South Dakota. You're exactly right. It's filmed in South Dakota.
Okay, I remember those Western scenes.
Bonanza was, oh man, you couldn't wait to get home from school in the afternoon to tune in to Bonanza.
And I remember when color TV first came into being, everybody said, boy, you ought to see Bonanza on color TV. Bonanza sold a lot of color TVs. Clint Eastwood and Rawhide.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that one?
Yeah.
A young Clint Eastwood. James Arness and Gunsmoke.
Oh, yeah.
And Miss Kitty.
Oh, yeah.
Wanted Dead or Alive, a young Steve McQueen. That launched his career.
Back to Gunsmoke. Toby Keith had a more recent cowboy song called Should Have Been a Cowboy.
Should Have Been a Cowboy.
And he talks about in there how Sheriff never did hang up his hat at Miss Kitty's place.
Wagon Train. Remember Wagon Train? Ward Bond and Robert Horton, John McIntyre. And then Laramie.
Right.
Robert Fuller. And Clint Walker. Cheyenne. He was Cheyenne Bodie.
Cheyenne Bodie. Yeah.
And then there was another one called The Virginian, which was a big hit on TV. Doug McClure, James Drury. Clu Gallagher was in that one, and I remember that because Clu Gallagher made several appearances at Ghost Town over in Maggie Valley back in the 1960s when that was a popular TV show, The Virginian.
You're right, and a lot of those cowboy actors would visit Ghost Town. They would bring them in up there for a gunfight on Main Street, you know?
I guess my favorite, for whatever reason, Linda Evans was one of the reasons, but one of my favorite TV Westerns was The Big Valley.
That was great.
That was Linda Evans. Barbara Stanwyck was in it. Lee Majors.
Right.
Was one of the stars.
Yes, he was.
The Big Valley.
Always enjoyed The Rifleman.
Oh, yeah, I like that.
Yeah, that was a good show.
There were so many of those wonderful TV shows, and you can still find them. In fact, there's a cable network dedicated to old Westerns, and I have a brother-in-law that's seen every one of them numerous times.
My late friend Wiley Carpenter that I worked with at 570.
I remember Wiley.
Yeah, he was involved in a Western film memorabilia show and an expo thing in Asheville here back in the 90s. And it drew a lot of people. There's, I think he had Lash LaRue come in for the show one time.
And remember the song "Whatever Happened to Randolph Scott" by the Statler Brothers?
Yes.
Randolph Scott was another cowboy actor. And I always envied my friends when I'd hear them talk about when they were young, they'd go to the movie theater and watch Westerns on Saturday afternoon. And I never could do that for a couple of reasons. We didn't have the money, even though it was very cheap to get in. But due to the fundamentalist upbringing I had, I wasn't allowed to go into a movie theater.
Not on Saturday or any other day, huh?
That's right. I was grown before I ever saw a movie in a movie theater.
Well, I was too. I remember the first movie I ever went
stay at them pool halls too.
Yeah, there you can stand and stay off them motorcycles. And don't go near that water till you learn to swim. And the first one I saw was at
don't eat yellow snow either.
Was the Bonnie and Clyde. It was playing at a drive-in movie theater. My granddad lived during the days of Bonnie and Clyde, and he wanted to go see that movie, and we got in his old farm truck and went to the drive-in theater.
You know what I think I'm going to do when we finish up? I'm going to turn on the TV and see if I can find an old Western.
I think that's a good idea.
Is that a good idea?
I'd love to see Gunsmoke. Thank you, Dave, for all of the digging around you do for our show, Hot Mike with Houston and Hogan. He's the research analyst amongst us, and I'm the audio producer. Dave's the smarts, and I'm the hard work.
So this is Hale and Farewell. No, this is Hogan and Farewell. One of my DJ heroes when I was younger was Bob Hale on WLS in Chicago.
The Big 89, WLS in Chicago.
At night, they were one of the stations that you get in Western North Carolina.
Right.
One of the DJs was Bob Hale, and his sign-off was, "This is Hale and Farewell."
Hale and Farewell.
So it doesn't quite work with Hogan and Farewell, but I'll say it anyway. This is Hogan and Farewell.
Thank you, Dave, and I'll catch you later. We'll be back with more Hot Mike with Houston and Hogan. Thanks for tuning in.
Be sure to click the subscribe button for another episode of Hot Mike with Randy Houston and Dave Hogan.